Good evening, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am your host tonight, Dr. Jed Applerouth. We're going to wait a few minutes, or at least a minute, as the room fills up. It takes time for people to accept their way in. But I'm glad you're here tonight. I hope I can answer lots of questions, give you good information, and be a resource to y'all. So I see the room is still filling up. Let's wait for a little plateau, and then we'll jump in. One thing, we always do send a recording of this out to you all within a few days once we render it, and we'll just send you a link, and that link will be there, and that link is durable. I was just reviewing a talk I gave last year at this very same time, and those links are still up there. I guess we can thank YouTube for that and their infinite archives of all of our webinars over the years. So, all right, I think looks like we're starting to hit a plateau. So again, everybody, welcome to tonight's discussion of the path to college, looking at the 4 years of high school and things that matter. We're talking about academics, grades, rigor, summers, thinking about activities. We'll talk about testing, and then we'll have time for questions. So I hope I will answer many of your questions tonight, and let's jump right in. So one of the guiding principles, thinking about the 4 years of high school on this path towards college, which is the desirable outcome for our endeavors, is to focus on growth and intellectual growth and exploration, rather than trying to package yourself. It's more packaging yourself, choosing the right combination of activities or classes that might appeal to a college. So there's a piece here in terms of, and this is a real interesting dynamic. I was just presenting in Connecticut last Tuesday. We're talking about differentiating yourself, and my topic was about grade inflation. And it was, when everybody has A's, how do you stand out? How do you differentiate yourself among others? And the whole thing of students trying to package themselves versus, exploring. And then what does your 4 years look like in terms of this narrowing, trying to be something other people might want, or seeking and searching, trying to become who you are. And that dynamic of this desire for, I want to have this good outcome, but do I do it through, let me push myself into this, percussion bed of who you want me to be, versus do I get to explore myself and then see what happens? And ideally you go in the path of exploration and discovery, not let me just cut off parts that I think don't fit this story that I think you want to hear. It's an interesting way to frame it. So a few tips, just basic general tips. Over the course of the 4 years, one of the foundational things you want to do is build and develop strong skills for organization, for study skills. One thing I do at Applerouth, my primary focus right now is doing something called executive functioning coaching, where I work with students who are struggling. These days, I like keeping my evenings and weekends free, so I do a lot of college students. And the skills you need in high school become the skills you need in college, even turned up a few levels, because you have to manage yourself, your timing. There's much less structure. They don't give you everything spelled out, on Blackboard or on some software, your courses and your homework and your assignments. When you're in college, it's up to you. And so learning how to do this is really foundational for success in high school and then later in college. Also, being an active and engaged learner in the classroom, outside of the classroom. A lot of our learning happens outside of the classroom, and being a lifelong learner is going to be a big deal for your kids in their careers and beyond. And then also, being mindful. Is what I'm doing in the classroom and outside of the classroom lined up with, what I like and my goals and my interests? Are things actually coherent between myself, my interests, and what I'm doing in the class and my activities? There's a piece we'll talk about more tonight about balancing grades and rigor, walking this tightrope, where if you have very, very little rigor and super high grades, that's going to really limit you, because schools that are more selective want to see a balance of rigor and grades. However, if you push too hard on rigor, and for some schools, you're getting low B's or C's, that hasn't helped your cause. You have to maintain, the academic rigor, but also, keep your grades respectable. And schools that are very selective want to see a lot of rigor and a lot of A's, and some are less forgiving by the nature of it. Getting and staying involved in school, they're going to want to see, what do you bring us besides just grades and test scores? What are you going to contribute to our campus life? So involvement is a big deal. And then summertime is coming up. It's around the bend. And every summer you have to have at least one thing on that, 3 months or 2.5 months, whatever it is, that is exploring something that's interesting to you, that's exploring an interest, doing a job, doing an internship, doing something, for, a project that speaks to your growth and evolution. It can't just be hanging out. There has to be something where you are pushing, growing, developing a skill in some way for at least part of the summer. It could be 2 weeks, it could be 4 weeks. I was always a summer camp guy myself, which is part of my story of I like working with kids and so forth. But there are many ways to make a summer meaningful, but it can't all just be played. There can be some R&R, but you need something in there that's meaningful every summer. Now, I'm going to go through quickly the 4 years. I figure, that was the promise of the talk, looking at the path. And we'll talk about, where are you in this pipeline? And these are quick slides. Freshman year, first year, it's grades. Choosing the right level of rigor. You're not in 8th grade. Now it's, this actually counts. Doing some exploration, especially in 9th grade, trying stuff, going to a club, doing an activity, very low stakes. You're not going to be in a leadership role typically in 9th grade. It's just sampling, trying things out. It's a salad bar. See what's out there. There is, in some schools, an October PSAT is practice. And then you begin to notice colleges that are around you. It's too early to build a list, but sometimes, I remember as a kid, we travel to certain cities, we go to Boston, go to places, we might drive through the campus. We're doing other things, we're going to Faneuil Hall, we're going to, like, oh, there's Harvard, why don't we stop by and just look at it? And so you're beginning to get some kind of a sense of exploration of, oh, this is a big state school, but, we're going through Austin. Why don't we drive through, let's go to some of the music, get some barbecue, and oh, look, there's UT Austin. Why don't we look at on campus? Just getting a general tiny exposure to what does a liberal arts school look like? How about a state school? Before you're thinking about choosing or selecting or matching, it's just building a vocabulary sense, getting some more knowledge about this new world of college. Sophomore year. All right, grades again, because for these schools that are selective, grades are very, very, very important. And so you don't want to slump. You want to keep focusing, keep growing. You're increasing the level of rigor. Some kids do their first AP as a sophomore. Could be Euro, it could be human geography, it could be, something else. And now there's like an AP pre-cal, whatever that is. But in the grand scheme, you're focusing on grades and rigor. There's another PSAT in October. That's getting a little more serious, but still practice. And then at this point, you're joining a club, an activity. Could be then that, it could be you're doing something in school. It could be outside of school with your youth group. You're involved in some way. You're getting involved somewhere. And then summers, again, an internship, a job, a program academically, an honors thing, a way to just learn, develop your vocabulary about work and about, academics, and also just you're putting something that you weren't just hanging out the whole summer. Part of the summer, glorious, but not the whole summer. You need something on there each year. Then as a junior, all right, junior year is the biggest, it's the most important year in high school when it comes to college admissions. So this is the year, this is often the last year they get, and it's the year we are closest to college level work. So the question is, have you built a foundation to get you ready for college? And you're going to showcase this in your performance in college-like classes, whether they're AP classes, IB classes, classes for dual enrollment, and they're going to see, are you ready for this big game of college? Because most of our students are applying somewhere early decision, which is October, November 1st. So that those grades aren't even going to be on the radar for these admissions offices. It really is just junior year is the big show. These grades are the most important. They can forgive a lower grade as a freshman. As a junior, you are performing as a junior. So that is, and it's a hard year because there is more rigor. There are more demands. You may be in a leadership role in your athletics, head of the play, head of the yearbook, whatever. You're advancing as you're, gaining seniority. And then there is a PSAT, which for 1 out of 100 kids, it really matters because you can get national merit. But this is for the very top testers. Otherwise, PSAT is just a practice. But for a few of our kids, this is where they're really shooting for national merit scholarships. And then finally, test preparation. So this is where, as a junior, that's where testing needs to live for the vast majority of our kids. Some of them get a late start at the very, very end of sophomore year, the very, very, most advanced students, but almost everybody when you're a junior. And again, because so many of our students are applying early action, early decision in the fall of senior year, they want to have testing done by that September ACT, ideally, or by the August SAT. Because for some schools, the October SAT is too late. You were past their deadlines for, accepting the test score. So testing should be done by the end of junior year, by that summer before you're a senior. And in most cases, kids who are applying regular decision, however, you still have several more tests before that December test date. But again, a lot of our kids are going for their hardest school, their best shot for their early decision, early action. And that means being done before you're a senior. All right. And this is also when you're a junior, you are actively exploring colleges, programs. You're going to be building a list. This is when in the fall, I took my trip to the Southeastern schools. I took a bus ride and we're looking at UNC and looking at Davidson and we're looking at Elon and looking at Furman, looking at Duke, looking at other schools. And then that, spring break, my mom and I are flying around the country. We're looking at Penn, we're looking at Dartmouth, we're looking at Princeton, we're Michigan. We're traveling around trying to figure out what schools might make sense. And so this is when you're a junior, you're really, really working it. And also you're talking about money and financial aid and financial fit. Schools are not inexpensive. And I've seen too many kids make mistakes on the front end where they're applying to schools that are financially out of reach. And the parents haven't corrected them and said, we can't afford that unless you get some big scholarship package. One of my best friends, her sister, their kid applied to 11 schools, got into, I think, 8 of them, and couldn't afford any of the ones she applied to. And she got into Tulane, couldn't afford it, got into Brandeis, couldn't afford it, got all these schools, took a gap year, and then applied to all new schools and went to one that was not as prestigious, but offered her money, and it was about half the price. So financial fit, you have to be having these discussions early, and even as you're building the list, and kids have to understand. It's not, honey, dream big, shoot for the moon, but it's if there's no, if we don't get a certain aid package, we can't go. That should happen early, not after the fact, because that's a hard thing. And you're researching, you're talking to your, at your school, your career counselors, your advisors, or your college counselors. You're doing research, you're building your spreadsheets. So junior year is the big year. That's when everyone's on. And then when you're a senior, this is it. You have one more semester of grades. They're going to see, if you're applying early, they'll see midterm grades. But you can't totally slack. If you start failing classes, they can, or getting C's, they can retract admission if you go from all A's to a bunch of C's and that kind of thing. That's your legacy year, whatever you're going to accomplish in your activities, your, the yearbook, the play, Model UN, whatever you're into, getting your service hours. And you're choosing, the schools for early decision, early action, regular, and then eventually, before May 1st, you decide where you're going to go. And then you say thank you to everybody. And then just make sure you watch deadlines very closely because they matter for submission of financial aid information, scholarship information, deadlines. You're going to have to keep spreadsheets for when everything is due, or you're going to hire a consultant to help you manage it. And that's also a possibility. But this is where it's a lot of organizing, a lot of executive functioning. You're managing a lot of things at once when you're a senior. All right. So the college search process. Now, I mentioned, when you're a freshman, maybe you drive by a campus. And when you're a sophomore, begin to think, begin to listen. You have siblings or so-and-so's going, and you begin paying attention to kind of schools and begin thinking about types. And this is where it's really meaningful. Even when you're a sophomore, like I live in Atlanta, and we have different types of schools within 10 miles of where I live. You have Emory. You have a top 25 school, research university that, my daughter goes to Glenn School right there on their campus. And you drive by, you can walk by, you can do a tour and see what that feels like. You're in a suburb of Atlanta. Then you have a city school. You can go and do a tour of tech. What's it like, or Georgia State, where I went for my master's and my PhD. It's like you could hang out, what's it like being on campus? And it's seeing and getting a sense of, would I like this? And then, you drive a little bit, there's Athens. You have this powerhouse SEC school, great sports, rah-rah, it's a much bigger school. Then you also have, you drive a little, you have Elon, or you have, you have Furman, you have schools that aren't that far away, that are much smaller, more remote, and getting a sense of what do you like. And I learned pretty quickly. I went and saw a few remote schools, and I'm like, I do not want to be far away, which is to rule out the Dartmouths and the Ithacas and other places where I want to be where there's action. So I was looking more at cities. I ended up in Philadelphia for 4 years. But you get a sense by doing this type investigation. So again, not list building, but type. Also, you might explore a small, liberal arts school, or down the street over in Decatur. There's the all-girls school, which now I'm blanking on. But again, you can just, do a tour and get a sense of, is this appropriate in terms of the size, or this is way too small, way too big? getting a sense of, the kind of work they do. I have students now at Northeastern or Tech where they do co-ops and they're working for part of it. Do I want to do that and have some work experience before I get out of school? Do I want the big rah-rah, the big sports? I went to a very small private school. I went to Pace Academy where our graduating class was 100 kids. We had no football. And one of my requirements was I need football and I want a much bigger school. And so getting a sense as where am I coming from and where do I want to go? This is happening, thinking this kind of thinking sophomore, junior year. And then, of course, I mentioned to you, as a sophomore, getting smart about money, talking about money with your kids. That's real. It's important, especially if, acceptance and admission and going is contingent upon a certain financial aid package. Kids should know that. That's important, I think. And then looking at the FAFSA, typing in, looking at, they have cost of attendance calculators. It's called like net price calculators, NPCs, and plug in your income. Look at the stuff and say, typically a person of your income level gets this kind of aid package, ends up paying this much money. And if that's well beyond your reach and you have 3 kids, like that's important to know. It's really a long shot because typically they're going to offer me 30 grand off, but it's 30 grand off of 80 grand. So it's still really expensive. Or this school, no, it's, out the door, I'm going to be spending like 35. That I could do. That to me is as important as academic fit. There's financial fit, academic fit. I should be beginning to build that list. So when it comes to, getting into colleges, grades are first. Testing is having a comeback, but it's not anywhere near what grades are. So if the grades are really soft, it's going to be very, very challenging, unless you have some extraordinary talent that colleges want or some other attribute that they're looking for. Otherwise, if the grades aren't there, because grades are still the best predictor for the majority of schools, not for the Ivies. For the Ivies, they found that testing is the best predictor. But for, the majority of schools in the US, grades are the best predictor of performance. Typically, when you combine grades and testing, you get a better, prediction. But in most cases, grades are the best. So grades matter. You have to understand that A's are not as special as they used to be. A's are actually a very common grade. A is actually more of an average grade than it used to be. The question then becomes, what kind of A's? Are they really, really strong A's and, in really, really rigorous classes versus, my kid has A's. And just because your kid has A's and you're applying to a school that's very selective, a lot of kids have A's. And there's been grade inflation over the decades, and it's very real. So that's just part of the conversation about inflation. What's happening. There also is a lot of AP growth. There's more of an expectation that you're doing more rigorous classes. APs, this number has surpassed where it was in 2019. Now we're at 5.2 million. And so a lot of growth going on in the AP world and also in the IB world. And just being mindful that, this is last year, actually 2 years ago now, University of Georgia, this number is even more impressive now. The middle 50 percentile of kids who were accepted into early had between 8 and 13 APs, IBs, or dual enrollment classes for Georgia. Now, this number, it's more impressive when you factor in the out-of-state kids, because the profile for out-of-state students is higher in every regard in terms of academics, GPA, testing than in-state. Whenever you're looking at a flagship school, it's pretty surprising how competitive the flagship state schools are for out-of-state kids. I was looking at this. One of my best friends from camp years ago he was a double legacy at Texas, UT Austin. He went, his wife went, his kid applied, but everything was perfect. The grades were great, the scores, the rigor, and she was turned down straight away. It's rejected from Texas, like double legacy. And I was like, whoa, and then when you find out that out of state, the acceptance rate for UT Austin is 8%. That's like an Ivy League school. UNC Chapel Hill, we learned this year. If you're applying to UNC out of state, we have one of my niece got turned down, friends turned down. The out of state to UNC Chapel Hill is 6% admission rate, 6%. That's like what Yale was a few years ago. So these state schools are very different. And the flagship state schools, I mean, you're paying 3 times out of state what you're paying in state, but they're still a great deal compared to the private schools. And so that's one of the reasons why they're so darn selective. Be mindful of that. So grades, they're really a big deal, but grade trends, you want to be careful and mindful and thoughtful about, are my grades getting strong or staying strong as I go to more advanced rigorous classes? You don't want the pattern of you get to the more advanced college-like classes and grades start plummeting, because that's a really bad sign for, are you ready for college? And so you can have a 3.5, but it could be a 3.5 where I started off as a rock star and then I began falling apart as a junior and downward versus I started a little bit soft, a little slow, and then I get stronger and stronger. Colleges like seeing that stronger trend, or at least maintaining. You never want to get to junior year and senior year and start falling apart because they get scared about, are you going to actually come in here and also bail? Because one of the ways they're assessed and evaluated, U.S. News rankings, is the 4-year and 6-year graduation rates. They don't like kids who can't make it out and who transfer out. That actually hurts the school with their rankings. So they want to make sure you have the chops academically, and this is grades and grade trends are really important for that. And again, you're balancing the right level of rigor, and you have to look back at the previous year. How did I do with 2 APs? Can I consider 3? Or, I don't want to suddenly push a kid and way too hard, and then they're just all over the place and struggling, and everything's chaotic and hard. And you want to, push the student at the right level, have them push themselves. They're part of the conversation. What do you think? And don't take the AP just because. That's like, I had an 85 in the class. It wasn't easy for me. It took up a lot of my time. Well, then pushing you into the AP, it's going to be even more time and maybe even more of a struggle. So even though I think they want to see some academic rigor, maybe I don't push into the AP in that subject. Maybe where I had the 93 and it wasn't that hard, I pushed to that AP, whatever that one was. It could be psychology or environmental science or English or Lang or whatever it is, comp sci. But be smart, be thoughtful. Don't think of them all the same. Be balancing your own level, how much time things take for you, and you don't ever want to overwhelm the student, and which can hurt their GPA and their peace of mind and their mental health. So you never want to over push for the sake of trying to, be competitive, selective, and so forth. And be mindful that when you're looking, when you're competing against your own school, your own cohort. Students like you, they're also sometimes looking at, within certain bands. Now they are not legally allowed to compare, but they can compare across gender. And typically it's a little bit easier for the guys to get into the same school than the girls. Because on average, the profile of female students is higher. They have higher grades and more academic rigor than guys. And so trying to maintain some kind of parity, they want half girls and half guys. Well, it's going to be a little bit easier for the guys to get in. That's one thing. But now, yeah, the Supreme Court has knocked off ethnicity and race. But still, they're trying to find a way to factor that in. Often it's using other proxies for those things in terms of socioeconomic status and so forth. All right, the bottom line, you want to manage, take the right level of rigor, the classes that you can do well in. Don't be unraveled by challenge early on. And then prioritize your core academics. Don't put, your fine art class first or your band first. The colleges are looking at the core academic curriculum, with a closer scrutiny. That's going to be your Englishes, your solids, your histories, your languages, versus the your electives. Okay, and we talked about inflation in grades. There's also other kinds of inflation. There's also, I mentioned rigor. There's this kind of rush towards more rigor on the transcript, more activities, which isn't always the right answer. Now there's a whole big push towards research, where like 3.5 or 4 out of 10 kids get in the pen and have research. Now everyone wants to be researcher. They're buying a paper into a paper mill. I'm a published researcher and I'm 17 years old. Like, what is that? I didn't publish till I was in my mid-30s. But again, are these real journals and real papers and of any substance? And also we're seeing application inflation, where kids are now, because of these selectivity of schools, they're applying not to 8, but to 12 and 15 schools. And there's a lot, which drives down rates of acceptance and makes everyone more selective. And so it's a lot of hype, a lot of excitement, a lot of inflation. And how do I keep myself grounded and sane and not get too caught up in all of it and not push rigor too hard, do my homework and research so I don't apply to 15 schools, but I apply to 10, 12, and do things that are meaningful and beneficial. Activities. They are meaningful. They're important. Missions officers are looking for several things. They're looking for continuity, depth, and contribution. So it's not I did 50 things, but it's okay if I did 3 or 4 things, but I really like them and I got into them and I advanced my skill level. I explored things. I did some kind of a leadership thing versus I just stacked it with all these things. And ideally, you do at least one activity over multiple years. You don't do everything as a senior, but actually, I have some. I tried a thing a little. I dipped a toe in as a sophomore. I did a little bit more as a junior. Maybe I did some leadership role as a junior or senior. Totally fine. And it's good to have some involvement beyond sports because in most cases, you're not going to bring the sports you did in high school to college, except in rare circumstances. It could be for a club team, but typically, varsity athletes, when they're going to a recruited Div 1 school, it's very, very different. It becomes your life, which most people, I was a high school wrestler. I was not going to be a Penn wrestler. They're pulling from the best kids in the country. And so ultimately, what else do you bring? Do you bring service? You're into robotics? You bring, you're into music. That was my thing, a cappella and singing and theater. Like, what are you going to bring us and contribute to our campus? It's beyond just sports typically. Okay, unless you are a recruited athlete, in which case that's your hook, and you ride it all the way to admissions office. So in terms of that's, your hook is what makes you interesting, not just a straight academic kid. What are you going to bring to us? What are you going to contribute to the campus? And part of that, the hook is like, what do you do in your free time? What are you into? That eventually is going to become, like on your activities list, things you write about, maybe a supplemental essay of activity you do. And typically they want, a little bit more involvement breadth, not I did 30 things a little bit. Because they ask you on the Common App, how many hours, in a week, in a month, in a year, like how many hours are you doing the activity? And if it's I did 1 hour a month, so what? That's not really versus no, this is the thing that I'm really into. One of my students is huge into esports. He's actually on the esports team at Northeastern. So he played a lot of video games, but he got really good. And he's actually he's a varsity letterman at Northeastern, and he gets to sign up for his classes first, and he gets all these benefits because and he was on all these activities and teams in high school, which helped get him into this college. So again, something that you're into, whatever it is, classics, whatever, do you like to write? Do you keep a blog? Do you make videos? Things like that. All right. And then again, I was out in Hartford last week talking about, are you trying to position yourself or package, or are you exploring? And the narrative. And admissions officers are looking for, is your application, is it cohesive and coherent? It doesn't make sense. You say you're really into STEM or engineering, but you've taken no advanced math classes. Well, that's kind of funny. Or, where things don't line up. You say you're really interested in international relations. You're looking at, applying to a major in IR, but you didn't take Comp Pol, or you didn't comparative politics, or you didn't do anything with Model UN, or you didn't. They're trying to, look for a narrative where it makes some sense. You're into musical theater, music classes, all this stuff. Okay. But so they're trying to see if there's some coherence here. And when you're thoughtful, then you're making choices that make some sense versus I'm just bouncing around like a ping pong ball and there's no rhyme or reason to my application. Everything's all over the place, my course taking, my activities, versus no, they're trying to figure out a story of, oh, this is that kid. She's going to bring that to our college based on it, and it all, it's coherent, it fits. And so, but there's a challenge. The challenge is, are you trying to become something you think they're going to want? Are you trying to package yourself and differentiate yourself by, this narrow thing, versus are you still open? Are you still exploring and growing and becoming who you are versus I'm trying to market and sell something I think they might want? And ideally, you don't fall in the packaging, which is not authentic, versus the I'm actually living, exploring, I'm trying stuff, but through that, I'm getting more clarity as I'm still exploring. So you don't want to narrow the funnel too quickly and just, hyper focusing on I'm trying to package myself so you'll like me, which isn't ideal in many ways. Briefly, when you're applying to college, when you're a junior, or when you're a senior, sorry, they're going to have different application types. There's early action, which is not binding. There's restricted early action, which is a few schools like the Harvard, Yale, Princeton, where you can apply to your state school, but also you can apply to these top schools, but no other schools early. Then there's early decision, which is binding, unless you can't afford it. You're telling them, if you let me in, I'm going to go. And that you actually have better odds of admission by early decision. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 to 1 versus a regular. You also have schools where the deadline's a priority, and you're gonna have a better shot by applying, earlier than later in these locked-in windows. Then there's rolling, and you don't want to wait to the end of like December. Sometimes they have all the kids they need from Georgia, from private schools. What would have been a yes in September becomes a no in December. And then you have regular decision, which is going to be, the Jan 1st deadlines, standard stuff. And you can, you're in a bigger pool, lower rates of admission, but, that'll be, many of your apps. If they're not early, then they're going to be regular. Now, as more and more kids are applying to more and more schools because it's very selective and they're nervous about not getting into some of these schools, then kids are applying to 12 schools, getting 4 or 5 acceptances, and then they're only, I'm sure, going to one. And that means the colleges are having lower yield rates. Yield is the number of kids who show up and come to the school divided by the number of offers they give out. As yield falls, it gets harder for them to predict who's coming. And there's more uncertainty, there's more variability as yield rates keep dropping. And so that's driving colleges to put more attention, energy, and focus on early action, early decision. And then they're even, as they're trying to figure out how much aid they can give out, need-based, merit-based, they're managing their discount rate to make sure they hit their numbers and they balance their budget. If I'm giving if I lock in half my class early decision, I have much more control over a bigger portion of my purse, my budget, and then there's less variability for the remainder of the kids coming in regular. So a lot of colleges are pushing over 50%. Now some schools are in the mid 60s of 2/3 of their class are coming in early decision, which is then leaving a smaller pool, making it much harder in that regular pool, and so forth. And this is actually these numbers updated are even higher, where schools like Barnard and Tulane where a lot of the and Penn and Emory, they're over 50%. Duke. So ED is becoming very, very popular. There's more ED all over the place. And now we're going to pivot towards testing, and then we'll come back and have open Q&A. So I hope that answers some of the questions about the path to college. And now one area of expertise is testing and admissions testing. 2 big tests: SAT, more advanced reading and critical thinking skills. ACT is more advanced STEM, more math, more science. They overlap about 80% in content, though they're different in form and structure. Obviously, one's computer-based, one's paper-based. There are differences. You want to, find out which one you're better at and choose one lane. You don't have to have 2 lanes. You don't need both tests. One is good. And you want to do a practice. Applerouth, we offer practice tests for the SAT and for the ACT. You also could use your PSAT score as a proxy for the SAT. They're the same test. And get a practice for the ACT. That'll help you decide. And then ideally, when you're a junior, you're going to have 3 official tests lined up. You might need only 1 of those or 2 of those, but have 3 in the pocket in case, because there's something called super scoring, where they're going to cherry pick your best sectional scores. So like for the SAT, your best math could be in March, your best verbal could be in June, and those are the 2 scores you send to the committee. And the other ones you don't send. But super scoring is important. Things that matter: taking practice tests, spreading out your practice. When you put in more time, you get a better outcome. Having some momentum at the end before the official tests, and then having a goal. Having a goal is motivating and it helps students. Timelines: you're going to have 7 ACTs each calendar year and 7 SATs. You now have all these summer options. There's an SAT that took place in May. Then in June, you have an STAT. In July, ACT, August, SAT, and so forth. And typically, this lives as a junior. Some kids finish up, current sophomores, but typically it's as a junior. The structure of the digital SAT, it's short and sweet, and a lot of kids like it. It's 2 hours and 24 minutes with 10-minute break already built in, and only 98 questions compared to 215 for the ACT. So it's a very different test, a short test. You have a lot more time per question on the SAT. You have 60% more time per question. So it's much more spacious, less of a rush test. And again, I mentioned, like for verbal as an example, the SAT, you can get there in 54 items and 44 in math. The ACT needs 115 for the same scoring. So you need a lot more items using a non-adaptive paper test. The SAT is just short and sweet, and I'm a fan of it. So it's shorter, you have short passages, you have more time per question, a lot of benefits of the SAT. And now opening up the lens, the testing, most of the world went test optional and largely remains so. There's been a lot of action in the test required camp the past 3 months, but the vast majority of schools, 2,000 are test optional. So that's a huge deal. There also is test blind and test required and test flexible. So testing, we're seeing a comeback slowly, especially the past 3 months among the top schools in the country. So I live in Georgia. Georgia put back testing requirements back in 2021. They didn't last, barely a full year. Then Georgetown, MIT, Tennessee, Purdue came back on. within about a year of that. Then there was a gap. In 2023, there were no major announcements. We're like, well, this may be the new normal. But schools were waiting to get their data, to do their analyses, do their regression lines, and figure out, does testing predict performance in college? Turns out, screaming yes. Testing is a great predictor of performance in college. And the schools are finding also it doesn't seem to affect diversity or their other university goals. So Dartmouth came back, and also they found out that testing was a stronger predictor of performance at Dartmouth than high school grades. Same thing, all the Ivies found this. It was the Ivies plus MIT, plus Chicago, plus Stanford, and plus Duke. They all found out that, yeah, grades in high school are a weaker predictor of performance of these schools than test scores. So Yale came back in, and Brown, then UT Austin, they found that, they can't predict who will do well, without test scores. They bring in kids for certain majors. They need those math scores for the STEM kids. They need the verbal scores for liberal artsy kids. Harvard came back less than 3 weeks ago, and Caltech followed the same day, and then Cornell followed within a week of that. So we're seeing the Ivies moving over, and next we'll see. We're going to see more schools. UNC is considering dropping their test waiver in the next month, so that UNC Chapel Hill could go back test required. I expect them to. Then also I expect, I'm waiting for USC out in California to go back. Boston College is now shifted to test encouraged, and other schools too, they encourage testing. All the Alabama schools, Auburn, it could be University of Alabama, it could be University of Virginia. So we aren't done with this cycle. We're just taking a pause for this year because right now, it's too late. They have to give kids time to prepare and to test. So they aren't going to make changes in June for an October deadline. That's just insane. So they're going to wait till the cycle's over, but we're going to see more announcements in late fall and for sure in the spring. And so right now there are, some 15 top schools. We're going to see, upwards of 30 very competitive schools require testing in the next year. And we're even seeing schools like, Cornell, they had 4 of their schools were test blind. And then Caltech was test blind. We're seeing test blind, back test required. And so there's more of that coming. Again, the big returns, some of the best schools in our nation are now test required, and there's more of that coming. And the rationale, Stuart Schmidt at MIT said, our research says that without test scores, we can't pick who will do well at MIT. Over at Brown, test scores are a better predictor of performance than at Yale. They are the single best predictor of performance at Yale, said Jeremiah Quinlan. High school grades explain a lot less than testing does, Bruce Sacerdote. And then here we go. At UT, test submitters had higher GPAs, almost a full grade point average higher after controlling for high school grades and class ranks. So test scores were a big deal at Texas. And again, Raj Chetty, genius researcher, future Nobel laureate over at Harvard. Raj and his group, they're the big data guys. They analyzed like 2.4 million student files. Unbelievable. That's the beauty of his research. And they found that, yeah, test scores are better performance predictor than grades at these 12 schools. That's a big deal. And also here's from Bruce Sacerdote again, that as high school grades go from a 3.1 to a 4.0, it's not really making much of moving the needle at these top schools. Whereas testing, going from a 1,200 to a perfect score, it's almost in lockstep, going from a 3.2 GPA in college to a 3.7. Higher test scores strongly correlate with higher grades in college. This is the evidence. I mean, the evidence speaks for itself. And again, for the students, the current freshmen, those who did not send test scores were much more likely to be on academic probation under 2.0. And again, the GPA differential is real. So test scores, they're hedge against having all A's, they're hedge against grade inflation. They predict graduation rates. They help compare a broad applicant pool and so forth. And so the publics, we're going to see more publics getting back in the game. Florida, they've been test required forever. They never dip down because all their scholarships are tied to test scores and grades. At Georgia, you have UGA, Tech, and Georgia College. Texas, and then all Tennessee schools. There are more schools coming, and more in the South especially. I'm waiting on the Carolinas. I'm waiting on Alabama. I'm waiting on Virginia. But I'm expecting a pretty good block of Southern schools being test required. And Auburn's interesting, whether it's test optional only if you have a 3.6. If I have a 3.58, test scores are required. And there are schools in Georgia that are the same way, where I'm applying to Georgia State, under a 3.4, test scores are required, and so forth. Test blind. Caltech is now off this list. Let me scratch that. But we have some smaller schools: Dickinson, Idaho, Reed, Boise State, Pitzer. The big ones are in Cali. About 33 of the schools that are of the 60 plus schools who are test blind are in California, UC. But what's interesting is that the UC system, like UCLA, UC Berkeley, these great schools, so they don't have test scores anymore, but they're looking so closely at AP scores. And AP scores matter a lot more if you're applying to UC Berkeley, UCLA, because they need something to help differentiate kids. If they can't look at your 36 on AST, then let me see your APs. And then there are schools like Grinnell who they're test optional, but look at their language. That submitting scores may help you, especially vis-a-vis if you're high school. Here we go. If you don't submit a score, we have less information about your performance, and it can be an important indicator of their success. So they're test optional, but they really want testing. And there are schools like that. Yale was like that, where they were, we didn't find out till later how much they preferred testing until after they made the change back to test required. These can also affect merit-based aid. I live in Atlanta. If you're applying to Georgia or Tech, if you have at least a 25 on the ACT or a 1200 SC, you can get a full ride with a Zell Miller scholarship. Also, at schools like Alabama, my niece applied and she had a 1390 SAT. Alabama offered her $96,000 over 4 years. They gave her the UA Scholar because of her test score and her GPA. And so there are schools where testing still can lead to money. And just be thoughtful. Test optional and test blind are very different things. Test optional, especially as schools are very selective, test scores can still be very important. And then the question is, do I want to send my scores or not? Don't send weak scores. You want to send your strong scores that are going to help and augment your application. And there's a question of, did test scores kids have an edge? Boston College, they've now changed their guidance to test encourage from optional. But their data came out. Kids with test scores were getting in essentially 3 times the rate as kids without test scores. So without test scores, 23,000 kids applied, 2,500 kids got in. So the rate there was 11% versus about 30% with test scores. Test scores are doing something here for the BC College Admissions Office. We found out Yale came out and said the rate of acceptance with test scores, 6%, without 2%. That's one of the reasons they went and changed their, Tech before they went back to required was double, Colgate double, Emory double, Notre Dame double, UVA almost double. So there are many schools where testing means a lot. Then there are schools like Vandy, and where it doesn't mean as much for their cohorts. And Jeremiah Quinlan, and he said this. So they were test optional for 4 years, but then, quote, I became more and more convinced that we were not being honest about the reality of our admissions process. So we didn't know this until they switched gears. So it's like, how many other schools are doing this? We don't know. This is not public information. And students who were not sending scores were hurting their chances of going to Yale. So this is where, test optional, asterisks, but we don't know which schools are in this thing. And so then should you send your scores in, first get your baseline testing in before you decide. And then once you do some prep, are these scores going to add value? I want them to, because a low score, you never want to send. The same as you don't send a 2 on your APs. I don't care. It's like, if the school requires a 4 for credit, I wouldn't even send my 3. If they give a credit for a 3, I'll send them my 3. But don't send your 1s or your 2s. You would never send a very low score. And for STEM kids, if you're applying to a school and you want to showcase if you're looking at being a computer science person, an engineer, math major, physics major, pre-med, well, your math score could be more meaningful. And more kids applying to engineering are sending their test scores to showcase their math scores on the ACT or their SAT. Much less so for the gen ed kids, or it's more the business and STEM kids are sending test scores. Ray Clark says, go with your strengths. If your scores are on the top half, send it. If you're in the bottom quartile, don't send it. If you're in the third quartile, well, it depends. How are your grades? If your grades are amazing, you're rigorous for the strong, and your testing is third quartile, maybe withhold it versus your grades are only okay. And they can confirm it. Also, I'm applying to a STEM program. I want to be an engineer, and I'm the third quartile for the school, but I have a strong math and weak verbal. Well, for that program in STEM, make sure they see my strong math score, even though my composite is a little bit low, but my math score is really impressive. Make sure they see it. And here's an example. So for the buffs, the middle 50 is 1170 to a 1380. So anything over 1270, send it, period, full stop. Below an 1170, I wouldn't send it, with the exception of if you're in a marketplace where almost nobody applies. If you're coming from West Virginia, or if you're applying from, South Dakota, and they don't get many kids applying, that 1170 could be competitive. If you're applying from the tri-state area, if you're applying from, New York or Jersey or Atlanta, no, they have plenty of kids applying from these marketplaces. Also, are you a first generation kid? Nobody, your 1170 is your top five in your high school. Based on, then that can be different because they're reading it in context of your high school. They're using this thing. The College Board has a landscape tool to put you in context. And also in that third quartile, again, if I have a 1240, but again, I have a strong math score and I want them to see it, then now it's in the 1240, even though it's in the third quartile. Be mindful that the middle 50 percentiles have been shifting. Ranges are up all over the place because kids who have low test scores are not sending test scores in. Emory's average, like the 1390 was the low, now it's 1450. Colgate popped 13 to a 1420. Yale was about the same because who they've admitted hasn't changed. Tulane popped a little bit. Michigan didn't move that much. Ohio State didn't move that much, but Vermont went up 100 points. So we're seeing averages go up. And here's an interesting thing. Schools that are more selective, this is kind of a noisy slide, but schools that are more selective, they're getting more applications and their average test scores are increasing. And so that's something that, schools who are more selective with higher test scores. Okay, so I'm going to pivot here and just be mindful of the median tests have risen under test optional policies. So, and those test scores may be intimidating. You might want to look back a few years to the 2020 common data set and see, like for Vermont, their mid 50 was on 1182 or 1340 before the pandemic. So if I get a 1250, I may look at the current range and say, wow, that's a low score, but it wasn't a few years ago. It's only low because they lopped off the bottom quarter. I would probably still send a 1250 to Vermont. I would go back and look a few years back at the common data set, CDS. Just type in Vermont common data set 2020, it'll pop right up. All right. So again, Applerouth, we do three things well. Academic tutoring, you're helping you with your APs, your chemistry, your physics, test preparation, obviously, for 23 years. And coaching for executive functioning skills, helping kids get better grades. These are things that we do. And now I want to open it up and I want to talk to you. So there's one question in the kitty. Please type your questions in now. We have 12 minutes and I want to answer questions. All right, Delise, I understand the importance of AP classes. How do the AP scores themselves play into admissions? Well, you are not required to send AP scores for admissions. They're optional. They're totally optional. However, Yale did a thing where they're test flexible. So either I must send my SAT or ACTs, or I send all of my APs or all of my IBs. And they're doing that largely because of California, because getting testing is still a total drag at Cali. I talked to many of my IC friends, and their students in California and Washington State are having to travel 3 hours to find a test. Some of the kids in Cali are flying to Idaho to get a test, which is totally insane. And for that reason, when Yale announced we're going back to testing, the exception is you can use APs, especially for those kids in Cali. You can't get testing. Because what happened is when UC and Cal State went test blind, a lot of high schools stopped doing testing on weekends. And now Caltech is back test required. And I wouldn't be surprised if Stanford goes back in the fall or in the spring. So it's going to be tough for those kids, but that's why kids are driving 3 hours and flying across the state lines. But AP scores, if you have 4s and 5s, send them. It's optional, but again, it's strong. It's like if I were the head of the yearbook, I would send it. Let them know. If my school requires 150 hours of service and I have 500 hours of service, tell them. And that becomes a factor in admissions. So if you have good AP scores, having the grades, having the A's and B's in AP classes is very meaningful. But if you have strong AP scores, it just validates even more so that you did a good grade and you actually learned the content. You achieve mastery of the material. All right. So I hope that helps with that. Next up, is it worth applying to state schools if I am from Canada? Absolutely, it is. Many kids, from Canada are applying and going to state schools. Again, it's not easy, but also they like international students. That's part of their profile. We have, they like saying we have students from all 50 states and 48 countries. So being from Canada, isn't a bad thing. And you should definitely, if there are state schools that are very strong and there's a program you want to be part of, like, my sister went to UT Austin, the Plan to Writing program. There's some amazing state schools here, and some of them are very different, and many of them are cheaper than the private schools. And so I would say yes, you should definitely apply to state schools if you're from Canada. Are AP classes better than dual enrollment when filling out college apps? No, they're not. Dual enrollment and AP classes, part of it is you go to dual enrollment when you've maxed out your AP classes. So if I have the option of taking AP English or going and taking a community college AP English class, take your AP at local because they're comparing you vis-a-vis your peers. But if you've maxed out things or you want to go on to differential calculus or equations, they don't offer that at your high school. Take it at online, take it at a local community college, or take it at Georgia Tech. And so they're not, so APs, are they more important? No, but I wouldn't go to dual enrollment until I've capped and maxed out the APs available to me at my high school. So they're both important, but they're like sequential. APs first when APs are maxed out, and dual enrollment, typically. What are some preparation tips to ensure you get a great test result? So practice tests, and then you have to have a mastery orientation. Whatever you're missing is really, really important. That feedback of I missed number 13, I missed 1825. Stop what you're doing, go back and look very closely at 13. What did I choose? I chose B. The answer was C. Why was the answer C? And actually studying, look for someone to explain it. Either it's Khan Academy, buying a book with explanations, working with a tutor. Understanding why you're missing problems is absolutely fundamental. You have to master the timing. If you're doing the SAT, make sure you understand the Desmos calculator. Very, very important. I'd say pivotal to learn how to use that. The timing of the ACT is really foundational. It's a very fast test. And you might have the content nailed, but you have to get the pacing down. So practice tests. And of course, so there's self-prep, self-study. Then there's doing a group class. Then there's private tutoring. We do groups and private tutoring if you want to really push that. But some kids are totally self-starters. They have the materials. Other kids do better having someone help them and coach them and guide them through it. All right. How do state colleges rank compared to some of the Ivies? Well, I mean, they're called public Ivies. The UNC Chapel Hills, University of Virginia, University of Michigan, UT Austin. These are great. I mean, UCLA, UC Berkeley is a top 25 school in the country. So we have some outstanding state schools. Some of them are doing cutting edge research, pipelines to the career world. And so you can go pull up the top 50 rankings. I mean, it may be subjective. Is it US News, Princeton Review, whose rankings? But you're going to find, the top 50 schools in the country. I mean, typically the Ivies, they have such deep endowments. They have so much money. The Harvards and the Princeton, they have 30, $40 billion. So they're incredibly well resourced. But a lot of the state schools also, they have patents. UT Austin has all the oil money, there's definitely that they can buy great professors, they can buy great departments. And so the top publics, though, are very, very impressive, and they're great schools. And I wouldn't look askance at them in any regard. They're outstanding schools in the U.S. Also, what's better for art students, the ACT or the SAT? I couldn't tell without giving kids a practice test. And so again, SAT has 11th grade level of reading. ACT is more of a 9th grade level of reading. There's more advanced math on the ACT. There's more speed. So give your kid both. Do a practice test. ST is only 2 hours, 20 minutes. You can do it on a weekend, and the ACT is only 3 hours and a half. So I would recommend taking both and then comparing the scores and then going from there. All right, I'm part of the early college program. It's dual enrollment program where I go to community college full time. Is it still as rigorous as AP classes? I only took one before going to early college. Now, if you're in an early college program and it's part of what your high school offers, then you're not opting out. You're doing this supported, endorsed by your high school. Totally fine, totally appropriate. They're going to be impressed by that. The whole thing is, what does your high school offer? And if it's I could take BC calculus here, which is rigorous, or I can go and take a calculus at a less rigorous community college. In some cases, you're stepping down, but in this case, it's part of your high school's program. It's called early college. I think it's great, and it's going to be impressive to admissions officers. So you're in a good place. Timing. It's been recommended that my son take the SAT as a sophomore because of his advanced math. However, he'll be out of the country all summer doing a State Department management program. Cool. I'm unsure if I should just let him take it with basic prep like Khan Academy and then impact his first score, just wait until junior year and get some prep, but risk him competing against those who have just taken math class who took a year before advice. So there is super scoring, and a lot of colleges will super score. So what you could do is go in there and just take it. And you get to choose score choice, which scores you submit. So it could be if your kid tanks this one and the verbal is just really rough, then you wouldn't send it. But if school super score, you would send that math and then go and prep hard, do the verbal as a junior, and then that's your super score. And honestly, you're not going to lose that much over the course of 6 months, and we're going to refresh it and make sure he knows what he has to know for the algebra 2, the graphing, the Desmos calculator. So I wouldn't sweat too much, but I would probably go and spend the $50 or take the SAT, just lock in that math, and then again, you can review it later on when he's prepping for as a junior. So I think he'll be fine. But we have plenty of kids who are in the same situation and they take it as juniors, and they're totally appropriate, totally fine. All right. Okay, next question. I got an 1130 on the ST and a 23 on the ACT. Which one is better? Well, all you have to do is look up the concordance tables. I'm fairly sure an 1130 is slightly higher, but you're in this range of indifference. You're within the margin of error on both tests. So I would say, it's whichever one you felt better at, but I think you're slightly better on the SAT if that one felt good to you. But okay. Will colleges know if you're taking regular classes at a high school that's nationally known to be one of the most rigorous high schools in the country versus APs? Yeah, if you're a super rigorous high school, if you're at New Trier up in North Shore and in Chicago, yeah, they know that New Trier is a super rigorous high school. If you're at TJ, Thomas Jefferson, DC, that's a super rigorous high school, one of the top magnets in the country. Then yeah, they're going to know that that school has a reputation. They're also going to have data how those kids from TJ and New Trier did once they got to college. So they know even if kid has a 3.2 at Thomas Jefferson, that often will translate to a 3.6 at a more rigorous college. And so they're going to give you credit if you go to a named high school that's extremely rigorous and known. They do track performance over time for those kids. If my son gets a B in an AP by a 4 or 5 on the AP, does the B matter? Well, the B still matters. It doesn't negate the 5, but getting the 5 certainly confirms and validates that you master the material. It could have been that you were delinquent in turning things in or whatever happened, or homework or attendance. But getting a 5 is impressive, but ideally you have an A in the AP, but a 5. But some teachers are very tough graders, and maybe they give very, very few A's. And it could be a B or B plus. But a B plus is better than a B for the honors classes, for the AP classes. But having the 5 matters, but I think honestly, having the grade matters a little bit more than having the test score. Because again, it's optional to send those 4s and 5s in, but you're required to send that GPA in. But the best case is you get good grades and good AP scores. All right, if you are an A and B student at a rigorous high school with consistent outside interests, should you still apply to reach schools? Yeah, you should always apply to reach schools. You should have your foundational schools, your core schools you're going to get into, and then you always have a couple reaches because you never know what they're looking for. And if you have some activity that's really interesting, you don't want to have 12 reaches and no foundation schools, your schools where you feel very confident. But it's totally appropriate to have 2 to 4 reaches on your list. To see, because take your swing, but there are people who have all schools whose rates acceptance are in the 5th percentile, and there are kids who get nothing. There are kids who have all A's and did all the great stuff, good scores, and get the big 0. They apply to these top schools, and they don't have any backups or foundational schools. Can you give a general test prep schedule? For example, starting prepping. Yeah, a general schedule is you're starting prepping about 2.5 months out, 10 weeks out. Let's say you're going to take 3 practice tests over, every few weeks. You're going to do, let's say, an hour and a half, 2 hours of prep a week. With a tutor, let's say, or on your own, you at home doing at least 3 hours of practice and homework. And so, you're prepping, you're putting in 30, 40 hours of prep and then taking the test. And then that's for your first test, second test, you bring it down a level, you you lower the prep, maybe you meet an hour every other week or every week, and the homework decreases. And then for your third test, you've already seen a lot, just keep it fresh. But the number of hours really does go down. You're really bulking up for the first test, putting in the lion's share of your energy and time. And then it reduces for the subsequent tests. If you need them, sometimes kids are one and done. But planning on taking 3 in case you need them for your for the super scoring. All right, last up, who are the best people to get recs from? Teachers, coaches, places where you volunteer. Many colleges are going to specify they want a math teacher within the last 2 years, a verbal teacher. Ideally, you get a split. Someone who knows the math mind, someone who knows the verbal mind, kind of round you out. I got well, though, you know what? I chose teachers with whom I had the best relationships. I chose my AP history teacher who had seen me twice for Euro and Compol and government. And then I also chose my French teacher. But I was applying to an international studies and business program. So it was like international languages and history. So you want to choose teachers who are going to go to bat for you, put in time for you, not the ones where you have the highest grades per se, but the ones where you had the best relationship, where they saw you intellectually engaged, they saw you showing up, and they can write something non-generic. You don't want a boilerplate rubber stamp because they can read that in a minute if you didn't have rapport with the teacher. You want rapport with the teacher, and typically it's in the last couple of years versus your freshman year. And some of them will, allow you to submit something out, a third person, a volunteer, Boys and Girls Club, something else, or a coach, totally fine. But the academic recs are more important, in almost all cases. Okay. All right, y'all. So if you need any help at all with these services, getting into college, that's what we do. Thanks for coming out tonight. We'll send you a copy of the recording. And again, don't hesitate to reach out if it can be a resource to y'all. All right, everybody. Have a good night. Thanks for coming out.